Morning, good afternoon, good evening. We'll get started today, as I know it's a tight virtual COP Pavilion schedule, and we want to make sure everybody's able to get good input from this session and then the ones following as well. So thank you for joining us. My name is Emma Kraus, and I'm a project manager at the ICAP Secretariat. I have the pleasure today of being joined by Justin Macinante in discussing his new book, Effective Global Carbon Markets, Networked Emissions Trading Using Disruptive Technology. Justin is a postdoctoral researcher and tutor in climate change law at the University of Edinburgh's Law School. Before turning to academia, he worked extensively in the private sector and in the Australian public sector in New South Wales on environmental law, climate change policy, and carbon markets. Justin's book offers a model that can connect carbon pricing mechanisms from different jurisdictions so that their policies and programs are more effective and operate more efficiently, specifically by leveraging distributed ledger technology. So really an interesting topic, and I know we're all eager to learn about ways to improve and enhance carbon markets around the world. So thrilled to have Justin here today to connect with us. So I'll start us off. Justin, you are an Australian living and working in Scotland, and you're interested in the governance and regulation of carbon markets. Give us some context. How did you end up at the University of Edinburgh?
Well, thanks, Emma. I'd been living and working in Germany and Switzerland for a number of years as an in-house legal counsel for a firm engaged in end-to-end in the carbon market. And we did everything from project idea initiation to project development, carbon offtake, emissions trading, aggregating assets into funds, you name it, even did some advisory work. Eventually, I moved to London, and then as I knew Edinburgh well, I ended up moving here. And by that time, I'd become involved with the World Bank's Network Carbon Markets Initiative, which I was involved in some of the conceptual development work with that initiative, and had also written some papers for the bank. And I felt it was important to continue and extend the development of that initial work in an area which had sadly been neglected in the academic literature, as well as by publications on how the carbon market might be scaled up. This was around 2015. And at that time, the carbon market looked like it really needed some reviving. So being based in Edinburgh, I decided to investigate doing some academic research at the university. And this was fortunate because Edinburgh has a very strong research base around climate and carbon in a number of fields and across many disciplines. The law school, business school, various science and technology fields. For example, there's the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation amongst some of the many other areas that are covered in the scientific and technological areas. So it was quite a good opportunity, and I took it.
Yeah, makes sense. And it seems to have worked quite well. You've put out quite a few publications, and now this really engaging book. So let's get right to the book. What was the impetus for writing a whole book on networked emissions trading using disruptive technology? Because you're really sort of merging two key fields here. So what sort of got you focused in that direction?
Well, I guess the initial impetus comes from the frustration I felt, which was perhaps experienced by many others engaged in the field, at seeing the enthusiasm for the climate change engagement that had been evident in the financial sector, which had come through the carbon market, sputter and fizzle out once the full effects of the global financial crisis took effect, and as well as the end of the Kyoto Protocol first commitment period without the second period being agreed. And there are other impacts which filtered through and took effect. So as an illustration, perhaps I could say, my experience had been of going to Carbon Expos back in 2006, 2007, where the events were literally bursting at the seams with enthusiasm. There were new entrants, new ideas, new products. It was actually a really exciting time. But then by 2014, 2015, it was like going to the wake after a funeral. And, you know, the events were smaller, fewer participants, and there was really waning enthusiasm. And I felt this was a terrible wasting of a critical resource for climate policy. It was very inefficient to lose all that knowledge, interest, support, and enthusiasm which had grown up. So the purpose in my doing the research at Edinburgh and in writing the book is to communicate that there are ways to revive and scale up the carbon markets in ways that perhaps haven't been fully explored to date, to make the carbon market part of mainstream financial markets, in that universe of markets, so that it works efficiently and effectively to achieve outcomes for which it exists, and that this can happen relatively quickly and easily, given a little support and commitment from a couple of jurisdictions willing to initiate what could then become a snowballing success with other jurisdictions and private financial sector appreciating the opportunities.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So really an opportunity to take advantage of that and really get that momentum going. Yeah. Okay. Can you go a little bit more in depth to actually how the model works?
Yeah, sure. The model I propose in the book is networking of carbon markets, for example, emissions trading schemes from different jurisdictions, using a distributed ledger technology platform for the IT architecture. So clearly there are two elements to the proposal. First, the markets from each participating jurisdiction are networked, not linked. And secondly, the IT infrastructure applied is based on distributed ledger technology. So considering the first aspect, I think if we think just in terms of emissions trading schemes from different jurisdictions, what the networking means is that those emissions trading schemes remain separate, independent and autonomous. Very important point. Instead of being linked, there's an IT platform through which they can connect, or rather through which an authorised entity from one emissions trading scheme can trade with an authorised entity from another emissions trading scheme. Jurisdictions would elect to join the network if they could see an economic or policy benefit in the entities they authorise in their emissions trading scheme being able to buy or sell interjurisdictionally. And equally, if they were to perceive that such benefits no longer applied, then the jurisdiction could elect to leave the network. In both cases, joining or leaving would be relatively straightforward and time efficient. Now, turning to the second aspect, you might well ask, well, why specify the IT as part of a trading model? There's a couple of reasons I'd give. First, my aim is not to put forward half a proposal, but to present the full package, and clearly trading between jurisdictions will be on a digital platform of some sort. Second, the application of distributed ledger technology is a good fit with the disaggregated idea of networking. It's decentralized, as the network would be. And thirdly, the application of this technology offers features that fit well with both aspects of trading, emissions trading, that is the financial market aspect and the climate policy aspect. So then in very broad terms, the model is for separate autonomous emissions trading schemes to be connected or networked for the purpose of interjurisdictional trading, using a trading platform that applies distributed ledger technology. And this means the participating jurisdictions would need to use the applicable software. There would need to be an entity to run the network, obviously, and this would probably be owned by the participating jurisdictions. The ledger of transactions would be distributed, that is, some or all of the participants would hold a copy and update it. And there would be checks and balances, or the checks and balances, I should say, would be built into the terms and conditions for transactions. Finally, the units from the different emissions trading schemes need to be expressed in terms of a common metric so as to facilitate trading. To give you an illustration, if one emissions trading scheme trades in units of oranges, say, another one trades in units of lemons, and a third one trades in units of grapefruit, then the common metric that could allow trading between those three might be, say, the amount of vitamin C in any one of those units. So the final element of that model would be a mechanism to work out how much vitamin C there is in any particular unit. Thus here in the model I'm proposing, the common metric in the model is the mitigation value of that is the value of the outcome of a mitigation action. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, okay, super interesting. I have about 6 questions that come to me after you kind of going into it in depth, but I think the first one that I'll go to is why network and not link? ICAP did some work on linking recently in past years, benefits of linking, and the sort of economic benefit that you highlighted at the beginning of that answer is one of the clear reasons for linking, to create more liquidity in the market.
Yeah.
I'd be really curious why networking is the strategy instead of linking for you.
Yeah, you're right. And to date, the approach taken to connecting jurisdictions emissions trading scheme has been for them to link, which usually entails negotiation of a formal contractual arrangement. A primary consideration for such negotiations would be the compatibility of the respective emissions trading schemes, which would then need to adapt to each other or converge in the negotiations. In the negotiations, the economically larger of the parties would have an advantage. Political issues, particularly the impact on sovereignty of the smaller party, can complicate these negotiations. For instance, the EU link to Switzerland took 10 years to operationalise. Examples of possible complications might be the extension of design features from the larger jurisdiction scheme to the smaller one, and the reduction in control, say, for the administrator of the smaller scheme. So the advantages of networking that I perceive over linking can be viewed in terms of 4 different types of issues. Firstly, there's the political issues, the issue of sovereignty or loss of control or of convergence, as I've mentioned. Equally, economic and emissions profiles of jurisdictions are not necessarily the same, and they will change over time as well. These are all factors that need to be built into the negotiations. Networking parties, on the other hand, don't have to come to an agreement with each other over these matters, because the parties that join the network just need to agree to the rules of the network. They don't negotiate with each other independently. And the rules of the network would be the same for each participating jurisdiction. Thus, there would be a level playing field irrespective of their economic size. Secondly, legal issues, the contractual harmonisation of regulatory systems, institutions, administrations, procedures, rules, registries, scope of the schemes, issuance of units, in general, ETS alignment. Under networking, none of these need to converge or be harmonised, and thus the negotiations from a legal perspective are much simpler. Thirdly, in a practical sense, the transaction process management is more straightforward because, using my earlier illustration, it's only the units of vitamin C being transferred in that example. So there are no issues about how to convert the oranges into lemons and vice versa in the different registries. It also means the network is not limited to emissions trading schemes, but is scalable to accommodate other mitigation actions. So long as it's possible to convert the units into a common metric, for example, units of tax credit or renewable energy certificates, then it would be possible to trade in such a network. And then finally, I've already mentioned the issue of flexibility, the joining or leaving. Because there's no political or legal convergence of the schemes, joining or leaving the network is much more easily addressed as a technical matter. So there are those 4 areas that I'd advance.
Yeah, okay. It makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. And to me, it seems that you're really trying to get at the efficient aspect of it, but also a fairness aspect as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And maybe you could articulate a little bit on why specifically distributed ledger technology is key to making that possible.
Yeah, perhaps not key, but I think there are certain features that it brings which would add very good advantages. And the 4 features that I'd identify are firstly, the immutability, what's referred to as the immutability aspect. The ledger would be accumulative. So new transactions are added based on the existing state of the ledger. This would mean traceability of the provenance of the units, which would increase the auditability of the ledger and the holdings and add to the robust accounting aspect. Secondly, The second feature I'd mention is decentralisation, and this relates to the parties involved. The system's composed of multiple nodes or computer addresses, and each potentially holding all or perhaps part of the ledger. Participants can interact directly rather than needing to transact through a centralised gatekeeper. Thus, speed of the transaction is not dependent on the centralised party. Another aspect of this is that the system has increased resilience, as if one node loses data, it can recover from another node. It also means the means by which parties transact, the so-called smart contracts, the code for these can embody all the necessary financial and environmental rules, so that only those transactions that comply with the rules could proceed, which would add another aspect of efficiency. And then once all the requirements were satisfied, the transaction would proceed automatically and irreversibly to settle and complete. The third element I'd mention would be the distributed aspect, and this relates to the informational aspect. It relates to how the ledger is held and viewed and updated. There'd need to be rules as to permissioning for viewing and permission to interact with the ledger. This would allow the transparency versus confidentiality balance to be addressed in the way the rules are set. There'd also be a need for a consensus mechanism, what's called a consensus mechanism between the participating emissions trading schemes administrators to agree which transactions to add to the ledger. And for those in the audience who may be familiar with these existing systems, it would be most similar probably in this respect to the existing Ripple platform, just in terms of the consensus mechanism. And there'd need to be, there would be increased system resilience as a result of this distributed aspect, because if one node lost data, then it could recover from another. Thirdly, there's the security aspect, and this would be a function both of the cryptography applied, so that attempts to alter or interfere with encrypted data would render the original data indecipherable. And it would also be a matter of the overall system design, which would be evident in the permanent accumulative nature of the ledger, decentralised nature of the participating nodes transacting directly rather than through the centralised gatekeeper, and the ledger being held by some or all of the nodes on a distributed basis. Ultimately, how these features apply and whether they deliver the benefits that I've anticipated would probably be a function of design, which is very important. Design is key.
It kind of reminds me how we talk about just design is key to carbon markets. We're just bringing that down now to the tech aspect of this. Yeah. Okay. You touched on the political a little bit earlier, and for me, I'm a political scientist by training, and for me that was sort of the first thought when I was first sort of reading pieces of the book and doing a bit of research for our conversation. I'd love to, and you already kind of answered my question there, so I'd love to dive a little bit deeper. You spoke about how the different participating jurisdictions are going to have to agree on the ledger and all going to have access to it. Could you maybe talk about some of the political challenges that you might foresee there, and if there's any sort of strategies to addressing this that you can think of? Because I could see that, even though the idea is to create the fairness to the distributed ledger, I could see that being a bit of a challenge, especially with those bigger players involved.
Sure. The political benefits are perhaps the strongest reason why the model should be applied. But to recap, the political reasons usually advanced for linking or connecting more broadly. They're generally in terms of demonstrating leadership, applying pressure on free riding nations, reducing the risk of carbon leakage, and reducing administrative costs. And the model proposed provides all of these, but it also addresses political challenges that come from linking and connecting. First, where design features from one system extend to the other linked emissions trading scheme, this can impact on sovereignty of the economically smaller party to the linking. It also impacts on the role of the administrator of the smaller ETS. And it's also an incentive for the smaller or for parties to make smaller reductions so as to reduce their dependency on imports, I think. That's one of the risks. None of these political challenges affect a networking arrangement because the emissions trading schemes remain separate, independent and autonomous. Secondly, there may be distributional impacts that undermine political support. And while there may also be distributional impacts similarly under the proposed model, jurisdictions retain the flexibility of being able to easily leave the network if they're not deriving the anticipated economic and policy benefits of participating. And then thirdly, because the jurisdictions that want to participate in the network platform, all they need to do is to agree the terms and conditions and rules for trading on the platform rather than to negotiate a deal with each other. So in that sense, there's a level playing field. I do appreciate that the one area that's been flagged to me in which there would need to be greater consideration given is in relation to how to value the units from the different emissions trading scheme. But again, I feel that this is an area where there is a level playing field because the same rules could be applied across the board to all jurisdictions by putting in place a uniform mechanism which was independent, objective and scientific. And I deal with this in the book very extensively in terms of the governance structure, the legislative and institutional or administrative frameworks for making the system work within the framework of the Paris Agreement.
Okay, so a little plug there for everybody listening. To get the fuller answer to that question, you have to go read the book.
I had to get that in.
Of course. Okay, I have one last question for you, and then I want to encourage our audience members. If you do have a question, I think we will have time for one or two. So please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to your question as best we can. So Justin, you've done a great job of sort of outlining how your sort of thesis looks and how it could work. What would be the sort of concrete steps you would take if you were to start building this system out? Where would sort of the energy focus to start off with?
Well, as I've mentioned, design is very important and there's ongoing design work required for the platform. The software needs to be written. There need to be trading simulations and demonstrations, and there needs to be engagement, possibly by the regulatory institutions of a market such as the EU ETS, putting in place the appropriate governance arrangement for standardising the methodology to devise the common metric, as I've mentioned, the mitigation value. But basically, once the technical proof of concept work has been undertaken, it would be a matter of as few as 2 jurisdictions just trialling the operation of the platform. I don't think the actual development work on the platform is hugely difficult to undertake. Where the work needs to be done is in terms of ensuring that this marries up to the expectations of different jurisdictions, and so building that into the software. Yeah,
absolutely. And that political aspect comes back a little bit in that sense of, okay, you're creating a solution that could potentially help us, but does it really weigh up to what we're looking for? Yeah. Okay. Thus far, I'm seeing no questions come in, so I will take the liberty of asking one more and give anyone in the audience a bit more time to think about ones they have. Something else that sort of struck me when you were speaking, particularly about the potential to not only use carbon market credits in this sort of a system, but also renewable energy credits, etc. Could you speak about potentially how the voluntary carbon market might fit into a system like this, or even offset credits? Would this be something as well that you'd be able to assign a similar value to, or how could you see a linking coming in there as well?
In the greater scheme of things, yes, I could. The difficulty is, of course, that evaluating the common metric across different emissions trading schemes is basically applying a similar methodology to each. When one is evaluating the value in a credit, you're applying a different framework for assessment for units being generated out of projects. I don't think it's insuperable to be able to bring those two together and marry up a system whereby the common metric is common to both. And that's the general idea. So it would be the idea of coming up with a common metric would be to get down to a base level of unit, which is what would be traded. And so you wouldn't be trying to trade a European Union allowance into a scheme, conversely, some sort of credit from a project in Latin America, for example, into the European Union emissions trading scheme. So it wouldn't be the units themselves, but that fundamental base amount of the common metric. And so there would need to be a way of converting from all the different types of mitigation actions into that fundamental unit, and that is what would then be traded. And it's very similar to what you see in financial markets.
Yeah, and I would imagine if that were something that we're able to take off, it would make it even easier for financial markets to be players in carbon markets, yes, which is something I know jurisdictions around the world are constantly trying to improve on.
And as a final thought, I think it's very important to be able to scale up the carbon market and climate markets more broadly and make them be received as far more much more within the overall universe of financial markets. In other words, being much more mainstreamed within the basic political economic economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have about 6 more questions, but unfortunately, we're about to run out of time. And I want to be sure to respect the other panels following us, that they get the attendees that are expected to be there. So just a very warm thank you from all of us at ICAP and AIDA for joining us today and sharing your model with us. It really interesting stuff.
No, well, thanks very much for the opportunity. Thanks, Emma and Ernst and all the team at ICAP and also to AIDA for the opportunity. Much appreciated.
Many thanks. To all those listening, thanks for joining us. Please don't forget to take a look at the Carbon Market PAV website for additional events happening today and tomorrow. And with that, we'll adjourn the session.